Hello, my name is Barbara Geoghegan, and I'm a student here in the Visual Narrative program, and I'm going to talk about the series of events that led me to this podium. I grew up in Mystic, Connecticut, which is a very small maritime historic whaling town in southeastern New England. This is it. And it was a very small town. It was a very beautiful and safe place to grow up, but, you know, my brother and I had to entertain ourselves a lot. I am from a huge family, which you guys got to spend some time with during Annalisa's presentation. And I'm from a gigantic Irish family. And this is a portion of them, and they all still live in Ireland, but I was born and raised in America with my immediate family. So, and I bring this up not to talk about a cultural divide, because, you know, there isn't one, but just a sense of home and place and belonging will come up a lot in the work I'm going to discuss. I'm a 90s kid, so I'm very influenced by a lot of the wacky pop culture from that time. Pretty basic Simpsons and Sailor Moon on after school every day. I don't think my mom was pleased about either of them. But also grew up with a lot of classic comics and read a lot of Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes and my dad's copies of Tintin. So I always liked art growing up, and I was always encouraged to do it as a hobby or an extracurricular, but my parents are both scientists, so I went to a liberal arts college, but long story short, I eventually transferred to AIB, which is an art school in Boston, and I studied graphic design. So these are some of the design pieces I was doing in undergrad. And while I was there, I took one class called Principles of Illustration, and that was taught by the chair of the illustration department, and he was kind of like, I know what you really are. Come to the illustration department. So I was seduced and ended up double majoring in design and illustration. So I had always kind of worked in sort of a cutesy style, which, you know, I had drawn for myself, and I didn't know that, you know, that's a thing that people really like. So that was a great time, and I got to explore that and build up some confidence. So. Once I graduated from undergraduate art school, I went to work as a graphic designer for a series of consulting firms and handled some very sensitive material for a series of increasingly sinister clients. And I can't show it to you, but just know that it looks good. But, so I was working full-time, but I continued to experiment with illustration and comics. Here's a piece that I made in 2014 when I was working full-time. And I started making mini comics in this same kind of cutesy style, and really got into the Boston comic scene, which is like 5 people. But yeah, but something was still missing, and I began pushing myself more and more to create longer stories, because I really missed that from art school. And, you know, design for me was sort of an intellectual exercise at that point, but I really was sort of craving something more creative. And so I started making comics at my day job when, you know, my boss was away. And this is a comic I actually made about sneaking comics on the company printer, and I posted it online. It's fiction. Yeah. And I got a pretty good response, and so that gave me some real confidence. So I started looking at master's programs, and I looked at SVA, and I was looking at the design program, and, you know, it just didn't feel right, and the illustration department was like for high-powered editorial illustration gods, and I sort of scrolled down and I was like, visual narrative, what's that? And then I sort of decided to apply here and only here, figuring that if I didn't get in, I would apply the following year because it just looked perfect and I could do it part-time. So this is the piece I created to apply here, and it's a short 16-page comic about a friendship between two girls and how it disintegrates. And this was the first sort of longer comic I did, and like I bought a fancy brush pen and it made me feel like, you know, I was big time. And so I got in and I came here. And the first big project I did my first summer was a short animation for the legendary No-On assignment, where you are assigned an object, and I got a parasol. So this is sort of continuing on the themes of toxic, unhealthy relationships that is sort of going on through my work. It's about a sweet robot who loves a narcissistic parasol, and they live in bliss for a while in this landscape, and then there's some infidelity, and you know, just continuing this theme of toxic relationships. Things don't go well, and the animation is about the emotional and physical violence that they inflict on one another. So yeah, pretty light and fun animation. And so the next large project I did was for Digital Short Story with Jim Rugg and Mark Sable, and I did a short comic called Brunch about a sort of a clique of mean girls who have this brunch club, and they sort of recruit this young naive girl to join them, and they have very sinister intentions. So I'm still writing about unhealthy relationships and trying to subvert the audience's or the reader's expectations with my cutesy drawing style. So things also don't go so well in this book, but it was the first comic book I did with like a serious ton of dialogue and, you know, more than 2 characters. So it was very challenging. And around this time, I started thinking about thesis, and I had no idea what I was going to do, like, at all. So I was really stumped, but I had seen how difficult a time the previous class had had with thesis, so I was like, I gotta make this easy. So I came up with 3 things. I would set it on the water because that reflects where I grew up, and also you don't have to draw a lot of buildings when you set something by the water. I would use pencil as a way of exploring the textures that pencil can make, and also avoiding inking, which would also save time. And I knew that I wanted the main character to be a young woman who was a selkie. Excuse me, sorry. A young woman who can turn into a seal, and that she would be torn between, you know, her life in the ocean and living as a human. So I came up with this story, and I ran it by Nathan and everyone the first semester of the thesis here, and it was like so convoluted and terrible. And she had like this twin sister that was visiting her in a dream, and like she was like people were gonna like harvest her organs, and everyone was like, dude, no. And it was so bad, and it was bad for 2 reasons. One was that it didn't make any sense, and 2, it wasn't about anything. And so so everyone was like, you need to like take a nap and then just like reassess. So it was around this time that I went to visit my family in Ireland over Christmas, and so this is a picture that I took from one of my favorite spots. And I was really thinking about what I wanted this comic to actually be about. And while I was there, I sort of discovered that what I really wanted to talk about in my story was a sense of place and a feeling of home and a feeling of belonging. And I had actually experimented in the past using pencils in a short comic I did about another trip to Ireland. So I was like, okay, this is all coming together, all of these yarns, so to speak. And so this led me to create my thesis, Rona. Rona is a young woman who is a selkie, and she loses her seal skin and gets stranded on a human island and has to integrate with them. And once she gets it back, she has to figure out, where she really belongs. And like I said it on the water, hoping to avoid crowd scenes and buildings. So here is a crowd scene that was on like page 3 that I ended up drawing anyway. She leaves her blissful, daydreamy life as a selkie to explore this town. And she screws up and gets stuck there. So with this project, I just really wanted to tell, after having come up with this crazy story, I really wanted to tell a very simple story about feeling like you don't necessarily fit in where you are and trying to figure out what that sense of place really is and where you belong. And I did the whole thing in pencil, and I wanted to do it all in blue watercolor, and I ended up creating textures that I would scan and then sort of use them in a more of a collage-y way. And Rona goes to work in a textile shop and basically screws everything up like all the time, and it's really difficult for her. So I'd like to talk about my thesis installation for a minute, actually. I wanted to create something that would reflect Rona's situation on the island and also reflect her home underwater. And so I used yarn and knitting and crocheting techniques along with wire and plexiglass to create these soft sculptures, which I turned into this underwater seascape, and also used the Visible Futures Lab to cut out a little seal. And so this was a really difficult process, and I learned a lot about myself and a lot about the kinds of stories that I want to tell. My goal for this story is to further refine it and bring it to indie comics audiences at shows like Small Press Expo and Mass Mice, and just see where it can take me. So that's my story so far, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. You said just now that this has showed you a lot about who you are, but also what kind of stories you want to write more. Would those stories be more of this kind, more selkie related, or no? But or is there something else that you have in mind?
I think that I use a sense of humor in a lot of my work, and I think in the past I've used that kind of as a crutch, like subverting the audience's expectation in a way that is more mean than interesting. And I think that part of why this story was so hard for me to develop is because it's really earnest and honest, and the main character is kind of, I don't know, what's the word? Like kind of a dweeb sometimes, because she just can't figure it out. And so I think if I can just be more honest with myself and maybe be more vulnerable in writing stories, that could lead me to some more interesting places.
Hey, girl. Hey. So I'm always interested to know how people stumble or find their way into comics. So I know that you double majored in design and illustration, but I wonder if you would just talk about how you found comics and realized that it was like the best medium to tell stories in.
Well, comics are for boys, so I don't. No, I only read like Tintin and then newspaper comics growing up. I had no interest in superhero comics. And then like I have this really typical like indie comics girl origin story where it's like someone bought me Ghost World and it just like blew my mind, and but someone bought me Ghost World and it blew my mind. So I was like, whoa. So looking at that and Adrienne Tomine stuff as a teenager sort of expanded my view of what comics could be, and I became really interested in that form of storytelling, and I think it appeals to me because I'm like a huge control freak, and you have control over almost every aspect, and I definitely I would not have continued with comics if it weren't for just the community of cartoonists that I've gotten to know. So in that way, I dislike the word scene, but I was really nurtured by other people in my community to keep pursuing this. Does that make sense?
Yes.
This is more a comment than anything else, but I think you have a great sense of humor, one of the best I've ever come across. And I just wanted to point out that Twitter account everybody should be following. Actually, you should join Twitter to follow that Twitter account because she tweets like you wouldn't believe. She's very funny. And my comment is, I hope you do a strip based on the tweets at some point. I'm just saying they're very, very well done.
Thank you.
So my question's about your installation, because I think that that was so effective to use the yarn, and I never would have thought of that to be representing something under the ocean. So how did that come to you, and how did you decide that was going to be something that worked for this?
I don't remember. I just always knew that I wanted to do that for the installation because that's something that I've knit and crocheted my whole life, and I've always wanted to use that in an art installation, but I've never done an art installation before, and so I joked a lot in undergrad about doing it, but I'm the least fine arts person ever, but yeah, I'll just go back to installation. Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to have, like, I use so many textures in my comics and illustration work. I wanted to have something that was 3D and had sort of the same, like, tactile feeling. And I wanted to use all the skills that I had, so I just went for it. And I think Nathan and Tack both thought I was completely crazy because I was cutting out all this plexiglass stuff and, like, drilling holes in it and, like, putting pom-poms into it. But, all right. Yeah, so that was like the only thing in this process that I was like really sure about. Just yarn on the wall. That's all I knew. Yep.
I'm curious if you have any advice for the up-and-comers in the room. There's a few first and second years, right? So what would you tell them at this wise place in your life now?
Oh my God. Just listen to Nathan. Don't try to make it too difficult. All the movies and TV shows and comic books we read are made over a period of like 5 years by 5 million people. So, just keep it simple, stupid. That's what I learned.
Anybody else?
Nathan?
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Very influenced by a lot of the wacky pop culture from that time. Pretty basic Simpsons and Sailor Moon on after school every day. I don't think my mom was pleased about either of them. But also grew up with a lot of classic comics and read a lot of Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes and my dad's copies of Tintin. So I always liked art. Hello, my name is Barbara Geoghegan, and I'm a student here in the Visual Narrative program, and I'm going to talk about the series of events that led me to this podium. I grew up in Mystic, Connecticut, which is a very small maritime historic whaling town in southeastern growing up. And I was always encouraged to do it as a hobby or an extracurricular, but my parents are both scientists, so I went to a liberal arts college, but long story short, I eventually transferred to AIB, which is an art school in Boston, and I studied graphic design. So these are some of the design pieces I was doing in undergrad. And while I was there, I took, this is a portion of them, and they all still live in Ireland, but I was born and raised in America with my immediate family. So, and I bring this up not to talk about a cultural divide because, you know, there isn't one, but just sense of home and place and belonging will come up a lot in the work I'm going to discuss. I'm a 90s kid, so I'm very New England. It was, this is it. And it was a very small town. It was a very beautiful and safe place to grow up, but, you know, my brother and I had to entertain ourselves a lot. I am from a huge family, which you guys got to spend some time with during Annalisa's presentation. And I'm from a gigantic Irish family.